for me now, railing against economics, despite my channel name, I'm sort of thinking, I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I don't think this needs to be said anymore in this way. I think we've got a different battle to fight now. And if anything, I think we need more economists on board to fight back against populism and so
on. Economists on board to fight back against populism, and also, the central message to go out, that we all need to focus on economics, whether it's the economics of climate change or, economic policy in other areas. And so I think you're still in the right area, but I would agree. I think there's some kind of a way in which that's yesterday's perspective.
No, so it's really great to be speaking to you, because we met at the UCL workshop a few years ago. Was it 2021, 2022?
Oh, I think it would have been 22, actually.
That sounds right. It was more out of lockdown than 2021, I think. Yeah. But that was based around your book, right? I remember. Yes. You've got a copy as well. Yeah. Politicians and economic experts. So it's I bought it there. It's just like, it's so interesting, and it's so relevant to some of the stuff I've done, but also some of the stuff that I think's come to the fore since the book was released, in the past year. The relationship between politicians and experts and the population and intellectualism and anti-intellectualism. It just seems like this gets more and more relevant, not in a nice way, sadly, but like, hopefully we can shed some light on it.
Yeah, because the main thing I feel is anger at Kamala Harris.
Yes. Okay. Interesting.
If she could have listened to lots of commentators telling her to talk about the economy more and talk about it better, but that was partly a theme of this book.
Yeah, she didn't, right? And I think Biden, for all his faults in the 2020 election, he did. He was talking quite a lot about that. Whereas I think there was this really interesting debate, I don't know if you followed it, in the US, called the Vibe Session.
No.
Or the vibes are off sometimes.
Oh, right.
Did you hear that phrase?
Yeah.
Because it was about how the economy seemed to be performing very well on a number of indicators. So you had Biden's industrial policy, and there was growing employment in manufacturing, a revitalized manufacturing sector, semiconductors and the like, renewable energy. There was also high employment, low unemployment, falling inflation faster than the other rich countries, quite high GDP growth, actually quite high real wage growth as well. But there still seemed to be this real dissatisfaction in the economy, with the economy. Now, I'm somebody who I felt like I went back and forth on this, right? And I did feel like it was genuinely kind of confusing to me, even as somebody who's very listened to the people. I was like, man, every indicator we have is pointing up, but there's still something wrong. I don't know what's going on. Is it like a vibe thing? Is it the media? And maybe that has some explanatory power, but I just don't think, like you said, that they weren't prepared to meet people where they were at, right?
Yeah, what was almost the most interesting part of the research that we did, because it was aimed at talking to politicians, we talked to 100 politicians and we talked to them confidentially. So hopefully we got more of their real honest take on how they saw economists and also economic policy making. The most interesting part of the book was what they thought about voters. And, politicians are pretty expert on voters. So it's quite interesting that we specifically chose to talk to 100 politicians who were involved in economic policy making. They had either served as finance ministers or as chairs of economic policy committees. And they were therefore far more economically clued up than politicians as a class. You know, you've seen all that social science research about how one of the distinguishing features of politicians as a class is that actually a lot of them come from a kind of law background. And despite fears that more and more of them were going to be economists or influenced by economists, you know, numerically, that hasn't taken off to the extent that some people thought it would. So the politicians we spoke to were at least clued in to thinking quite deeply about voters and the economy. And what, but even so, what came out there was that, in a way, because politicians are quite moral and normative about the economy, you know, if it's what brought them into politics, then if they're on the left, they're going to have quite a kind of deep connection to redistribution that may even be the thing that brought them into politics, the thing that they noticed as a teenager. People on the right, politicians on the right, having, you know, an awareness they would often describe as a teenager, having become aware that markets weren't free enough. When you ask them, okay, so you have these quite moral economic visions, but how do you think voters see the economy? Nearly every single one of them, it was the most unanimous answer that the 100 politicians gave, said voters are self-interested. So it's like they recognized that they almost had to hide the morality of their own economic thinking and talk to the voters in more transactional ways. And they also recognized there was a problem in communicating with voters economically because, you know, voters had this self-interestedness. But again, this is part of the politicians' socialization. They weren't really critical of voters, you know, so they didn't sort of use words like ignorant or dumb, which is another quite interesting feature of what makes politicians tick, because they were doing confidential interviews. So if they'd really wanted to say, be angry and moan at me about, you know, how voters didn't understand the virtues of free trade, or, you know, the benefits of being in economic benefits of being in the European Union, they didn't really criticize them. They kept saying it's understandable that voters are so self-interested. It's understandable that they only really pay attention to what's happening in their pockets and whether, you know, what's happening with their job prospects or their inflation. And then you get to Kamala Harris and you sort of think, well, these politicians at least recognized that it was difficult to talk to voters, but it's almost like she didn't even get into the room. Perhaps because she didn't really have. I mean, did she really have an economic vision? Did she really have an economic motive for being in politics?
I think the thing, well, the message, if insofar as there was one, was that it was just a continuation of Bidenomics, right? And that, while I again do agree that Bidenomics had some successes, and it's certainly better than Trumponomics, I don't think that really works, because you're just saying during or just after a cost of living crisis and a whole bunch of other problems, a whole bunch of other things people are concerned about, the rise of AI, whatever, you're just saying, you know, well, it's fine now. We're just going to continue doing it, maybe with a few tweaks here and there. And that was, I mean, at worst, there was absolutely nothing, like you were saying. But then I think at best, it was kind of just a continuation of the status quo. But that's not going to resonate with people, right?
Yeah, but then she even, I mean, I understood the argument that she didn't want to just be the mouthpiece for Biden, and she didn't want to talk about his record, but to take that to not engaging with voters on the economy at all it was just so disappointing. And I mean, the few times that she did talk about the economy, she had this phrase about putting a brake on inflation, and it was always so unclear, and it really didn't inspire anyone with any confidence. So, you know, I did feel that in some ways, I mean, okay, I'm biased because I am myself mainly interested in economic policy making, but I did feel that the politicians in our book had a better understanding of the need to speak in a certain way and to message in a certain way to voters.
I mean, so you mentioned two things to do with your research there, and I'm curious as to which one of them Kamala Harris was lacking. I mean, maybe it's both, but one of them was like quite a coherent, moralistic worldview about the economy, which was really interesting, right? Because a lot of, I mean, let's talk about that a little bit first, because a lot of the narrative around economics is that economics is kind of right wing and it's kind of austerity and deregulation. Kind of Thatcher was economics, Reagan was economics, you know, let markets run, blah blah, that's going to increase GDP efficiency. Those kind of quite narrow, sort of technical, maybe a bit callous arguments that you hear. But that wasn't really true in your data, right? In the sense that right-wing politicians were much more about economic freedom, right? And that was their worldview. And I think you were surprised by how little they were saying, you know, let's just do what's good for the economy. It was much more about things like freedom, things like work ethic as well. And yeah, less about just narrowly economic performance.
Yeah, it was really surprising. And it was even true of some of the politicians who had previously in their past lives been economists, you know, lecturers of economics and so on. They said that their primary motive, there was a lot of this talk of the teenage socialization and therefore getting the moral economic vision quite young. In favor of free markets. But then they would say there's a way of thinking about economics as an economist, and I did that in my lecturer job. But when I chose to go into politics and become an elected politician, I started both, I thought and talked about economics very differently. And it was almost as if, you know, what the hat that they had put on in their lecturer job was very definitely a hat that they put on. And the way that they thought it was legitimate to be more moralistic about economics once they became politicians was quite striking.
It is interesting because I do think that for a lot of us, our economic views are quite profoundly shaped by our morality, right? I think that's something that people don't really want to admit. I mean, we talk sometimes about how economics hides values and it can hide sort of normative commitments to things like growth, for example. But I think maybe at least as important is just the fact that every single individual probably has like quite a strong base and strong worldview that is just going to shape how they use economics and how they perceive economics, right? And that's what you saw.
Yeah. And this did tend to hold, I mean, we interviewed in 5 countries, France, Germany, Denmark, UK and US, and then we interviewed across the political spectrum. And actually the one group who claimed to be less normative or spoke in less normative ways were the British Conservatives. And there you had a little bit more of, I care about free markets, but essentially it's about managing the economy and about being credible and about doing what works. And, it is a little bit textbook. But that's what's great about empirical research, because sometimes empirical research confirms what a lot of other writers have said. But, definitely the word pragmatic came up with British Conservatives far more than it did, for example, with US Republicans or, the French centre-right.
Yeah, I think that is quite a British thing, I think, right? It's quite a British politics thing that sort of, there's like a treasury view of like balancing the budget and not being too crazy and managing the economy properly, which I do think we're seeing is shared by Labour at the moment, right? As well, right? That's kind of spans across parties since probably Thatcher, and yeah, that I guess that makes quite a lot of sense. Did Conservatives in the book talk about their values at all? British
slightly, I don't want to be too stereotypical, but in a sort of slightly, a British stiff upper lip way. I mean, there was one of them that he ended up actually talking like a materialist, really. You could almost say a Marxist, because he said, "Oh, you don't understand that ordinary people just want things, and you can't ever." He said, "This is a classic British Conservative. I obviously can't mention his name, but he's quite a well-known Conservative politician. I want the consumer to be better off, not worse off. And for every middle-class consumer who may feel they've got enough goods and services, I can take you to someone who isn't in that lucky position, who is not on your income or mine, and would like to have more scope to buy nice things or go somewhere interesting or whatever is on their to-do list." So that's quite a kind of, I mean, he possibly was a bit unusual, but that's quite it's a sort of clash between a kind of materialist, don't sneer at people's economic aspirations. But, in general, whether it's a kind of like something about the way that the British talk, in contrast, how much more emotional and pseudo-religious, for example, some of the American politicians was, and that was striking. So there it was much more, they would immediately start talking about individualism and effort as a kind of in quite a social and psychological way.
And the left-wing politicians were also quite moralizing, right, as well, but obviously in a different direction, more about equality, for instance.
Yeah. And I think we did the interviews between 2020, 2022, in a brief window when I think the left thought they had seized some of the high ground and maybe had seen off some of the right-wing populist threats. And also another big theme in the book is about their attitude to the environment in economics. So with the left, I think there was a bit of confidence that partly due to the 2008 financial crash and the ongoing fallout, and also the degree of state intervention during the pandemic, and what they saw as the forthcoming greater preoccupation with doing something about climate change, which has not turned out to have happened, like 3 years on has not happened, but I think they were hopeful that it might. They were talking about Kate Raworth and donut economics, and how those kinds of economic ideas were going to get much more traction, not just with other politicians, but also with voters.
Yeah, it's a little bit depressing actually reading it now, because you're like, they do seem very optimistic, and there's ideas from sort of modern monetary theory and spending more money. There's industrial policy and equality and redistribution, and there's the environmental angle, of course, right? And like carbon taxes and investment in renewables, but also even more radical proposals like living, within ecological bounds, a sustainable economy, and so on.
And is that something that you would say that that strikes a chord with you? That is literally the last couple of years, a lot of that optimism has been dented.
Yeah, I think so. It's more about kind of survival now, and obviously the military situation has changed, and I've gone from being someone who would generally advocate for cuts to military spending, or not, at least not increasing it, to somebody who actually thinks that we probably should in across Europe, to be honest now, which is a sad reality. And you're just dealing with the fallout from Trump and what they're trying to do, and I just think it's the idea that we could get to some kind of circular economy or donut economy, or whatever you call it, does seem very distant now. And it wasn't super close in 2022, right? But it did seem more possible. And I think with the pandemic as well, there was that lull in economic activity, and people sort of took stock, and there was maybe some consideration of these ideas. And then now we're sort of back to not normality, but behaving as we were before in some ways.
Yeah, and the American Republicans I was talking to, some of them were Trumpists, but had not shared his economic beliefs. So yes, those American Republicans were mainly saying in 2022 he demagogued the economy too much, and were quite articulate about how hard it had been for them to keep on trying to convince voters of the need for free trade. They were also saying that free trade was an absolute cornerstone of republicanism. So you can see that they were hoping that 2016 to 2020 Trump episode would prove to be an aberration. And, probably most of them are no longer in Congress, because I think, I don't know how anybody could still have that genuine commitment to free trade, which has always been strong in the Republican Party, and be silent about what's happening now. So, yeah, in that sense, things have really changed. And yet, they were the ones who gave me quite a lot of hope, those free trade Republicans back in 2020, 2021, because they were quite interesting about how they talked to voters. And, they had all these little tricks to do with aluminium and the wrappers of Hershey bars, and taking
yes, I remember
a Hershey bar to their town hall meetings and saying, look, this is an aluminium wrapper. And the thing with tariffs is that you put them on aluminium and it actually hurts the Hershey bar factory. And they were impressive. Some of the Republican politicians in putting quite a lot of effort into talking to voters and educating voters. In fact, they seem to put much more effort into it than British Conservatives. It's almost like British Conservatives, maybe they have more of a right-wing media. Maybe it's just not so much in their kind of their way of thinking, but these Republicans were nervous that the American dream couldn't be taken for granted, and messages about that couldn't be taken for granted as much as in the past. And so they were doing a lot of Q&A type, going to factories in lunch hours, really making a lot of effort to have one-to-one interactions. And and that was the main message of the book. That was the thing that came out in the conclusion, which was that politicians will have to educate voters about the economy, in part because nobody else can. So, I mean, this classic politician self-aggrandizement, but they would say things in the interviews like, the media doesn't educate voters about the economy. Sure. And, I can say as somebody who's been a school teacher for quite a lot of my life that there's a real limit to what schools are ever going to be able to do to educate people about the economy, because you have to be out in the workforce really to have the incentive to learn.
Yeah, and also it's such a complicated topic for kids. Like, I think I'm not against economics education at school. Like, I'm the last person who's against it, but I do think people sometimes think that's like if you educate people about economics at school, then like that's going to have a really big effect. And I think like they'll just remember it vaguely, along with like, their history classes, their art classes, and the one they did on sex education as a kind of sort of mush. They'll remember like one thing from it, like what GDP means, which is fine. It's better than nothing. But it's just like people really, in these discussions, people sometimes overestimate. They're like, let's teach it at schools. And it's like, okay, but that's really not going to fix any major problems.
Yes, I can definitely say that as somebody who has taught citizenship in schools. It's the same when people say, let's educate children about politics. So I think the politicians we spoke to who said, we are the only ones, and we do have, two-way discussions with voters, because if you think that's quite an intense relationship, even if it's only at election time, they talk to a lot of voters and are trying to justify their economic record and find out what the voters are feeling about their own pockets and prospects. So there's a very good political scientist called Jane Mansbridge who's written about politicians' communication, and who was the one who used this phrase educative communication. And I think without loading too much onto how genuinely educative it might be, it's still an aspiration that politicians need to aim for. And that means that they need to tackle it, they need to sometimes tackle quite complicated processes and phenomena and things like trade and free trade, and inflation and what the causes of inflation were. But it cannot be ducked. And I mean, this is the other thing about the debate during the US 2024 election. You looked at, for example, the Truss-Sunak leadership contest, which I think must have been in 2022, and there was a higher level of debate. I mean, it might have been laughable at points, but they were both trying to talk about inflation and what had caused inflation. And then you compared that with the level of what was happening in the 2024 US election, and what I genuinely don't understand how American politicians from any party can think that they can avoid a kind of educative process, and that they can fail to see that the problems they have now are largely due to probably having had quite a long culture of not tackling those slightly boring, slightly technical issues.
It's interesting because I've never felt more sympathy and resonance with Republicans than when reading your book, because the Republican politicians that you interview were so near to the earth, And you said you used the example where he got a Hershey bar and he was explaining how tariffs impact it. I was like, that's great. You could do that in an economics class. That's cool. And there was another one where he was talking about working on a farm before and after school. And I was like, well, that sounds really tough. But he was like, his experience of it was that it was very empowering, and he learned that work pays, and he found it tough but rewarding. And that really resonated with me as well. So I think those stories, and they are moralizing stories, right? As we've discussed, they're really interesting. And it did seem that Republicans were trying to bridge this gap between, like, how do you appeal to voters, and my personal view, which is my own values, but also complicated economically. Maybe I understand comparative advantage or whatever. I can't explain that to voters. How do I communicate this, right? How do I show them how it's going to hit them in their pockets, right? Which is what they're perceived as being interested in, voters, and it's probably what they are interested in most of the time, right? So it's like they seemed much better at bridging that gap, Republican politicians, than Democrats.
Yeah.
Maybe better than any other group in the study, from what I remember. That really stood out to me.
Mm. Yeah, because in the study, I did have a sense from some of the older school Democrats that they felt that the whole ability to talk to lower income voters and about bread and butter issues had been eclipsed due to an over focus on social and cultural issues, and in the case of Kamala Harris, you could also say too much of a focus on what Donald Trump would do to the American political system, and I think that was part of it as well. And she just it's wrong just to focus on her, because I really don't think it was just her, but
Sure.
there was too much moralizing on the social and cultural side, and not enough of either the moral or technical stuff on the economy that needed to be done. And I think, let's think about, the election campaign in the UK, and there was more of that. There was more focus on the economy, and rightly on the economy, and actually, since they've been elected, that there has, whatever criticisms you might have of the Labour government's actual economic policy making, it doesn't feel like they have been doing too much sort of distraction for the sake of distraction. Do you think?
Sorry, I was just choking on my water. Or trying not to choke. Yeah. Oh no, absolutely, absolutely. I think they're kind of clear. I mean, they've got a harsh and austere message. I would say they're kind of clear about it. They don't seem to. I mean, I guess
they're actually not being moralistic enough.
Well, it's funny because there's this thing about Keir Starmer where he keeps talking about how his dad was a carpenter or something. What was his dad?
No, but his father. But one of my students has read his life story, and actually his father genuinely was a tool maker who sat in a shed making tools.
Yeah.
So, and really did have a low income and all the rest of it. So.
I mean, it's fair enough. Yeah, I believe him. It's just, I don't know. I think he just said it so many times that people started finding it funny. But so I guess, to be honest, they probably have been better about that than certainly than the Democrats, right? And maybe it tells you something, that even when the message is quite unpalatable, the fact that you're communicating it is kind of appreciated and understood by voters.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, do politicians have an incentive to be educative, as you put it? How do we enforce that?
Well, I think they knew they did. One of the things and for example, in France, they were much more aware of the populist threat in France than perhaps either the UK or Germany and Denmark. But there is a real strange tension, I think, where they were implicitly critical of the neoliberal era. I think they did think that they had allowed a perception that it was now, economic policy was now being done by arm's length agencies and had been depoliticized, and that economists were having more of a role. They did think that had perhaps been a bit damaging, because maybe before that period there had been no escape for them in having to educate voters.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of the really painful kind of election campaigns that we had in this country in the 70s and the 60s and 70s, where Harold Wilson would have to be talking about devaluation or really quite dry and complicated stuff like that, without any ability to kind of shift responsibility away from politicians. And I think perhaps the depoliticization that did take place, undoubtedly, during the kind of 90s and the early 21st century, meant that they got out of the habit. So there was a bit of a recognition from the politicians that they'd got out of the habit, and it had contributed to the voter backlash. I mean, that whole theory that Peter Burnham stuff about how depoliticization then led to voter backlash against politicians. Well, if you're not doing this policy making, and also things are still getting worse for me, then I'm not going to trust mainstream politicians anymore. And it's one of the reasons that I might turn to populist politicians who are still giving me a bit of economic hope, with their simple messages. So I do think there was a feeling from them, whether or not they'd read Peter Burnham, that that had been a mistake, and along with all sorts of other phenomena which we haven't got, is beyond the scope of me and you, I think, here now, to do with disinformation and different media sources. Like, they knew they had to do it. I mean, some of them did say it is the only way that we will be able to stop a new populist surge. And this was particularly, for example, French politicians.
You mean educative communication?
There was an amazing one of the French politicians who kind of moved me the most, kept talking about how the main thing he wanted is for voters to walk around saying, oh, well, it could have been worse. As in, oh, they tried that economic policy, now they're trying this economic policy, maybe the new economic policy has stopped it from getting worse. But, literally to just be saying, just be talking that simply about, well, they tried this with the inflation, now maybe they'll try with that with the inflation. And then maybe the economy will be a little bit less worse than it would have been under the previous government. I mean, that was the level of informed debate by voters that he was aiming at. But when you think about it, if we'd had even that low level more uniformly across American voters, we wouldn't have got Trump.
Yeah.
So when you talk about politicians needing to educate, it's not to a high level, it's just to try and get back to something that looks like reasoned debate.
You can't avoid the conclusion that most voters who voted for Trump didn't really understand what tariffs were. I don't like, you talked about economists using the word ignorant. Politicians avoid that word. I think that's good. I don't like saying that voters are wrong and ignorant and stupid and stuff, right? But it's like the evidence that they did not understand what tariffs were partly because Trump was obfuscating and also not communicating it clearly for his own ends. But that's like, and it's been a surprise when, the price of eggs has gone up, the price of coffee's gone up, the price of other things is going to go up as well, depending on what actually happens with these tariffs, the price of Hershey bars, presumably. So like that was just a real problem, right? A real barrier to understanding that needed better communication.
Yeah, it did. And I'm like you, that I really don't ever want to say, that there's that whole Brian Kaplan thing about, classic economics, that voters are ignorant. I never want to use that word, but, there's got to be a certain level of education and communication, because these are technical kinds of subjects. And, it's very difficult, but it does need to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, have you seen anything promising, since the research you did for the book? Any promising new developments? It's a tough question, given the current climate.
I suppose I came out of the book, and I mean, it may even have been, I did all these interviews in lockdown, and it was it was an incredible intellectual and emotional project, really, to do in lockdown, that I may have been captured by the politicians a bit too much. But it is quite interesting, and my colleague who did some of the interviews as well did have a similar feeling that, these are such amazing people. I mean, in terms of either their original motivation or their intellectual reach, or actually, above all, their communication skills.
Yeah.
And it feels they must therefore be the essence of democracy. So if we are talking about how we counter populism, we need to undercut the demagogues with these mainstream politicians, and there just needs to be a way that they try harder, I suppose, is the only way that I could put it. Because, and like sometimes I think we exaggerate how far the populists have got. Okay, the AfD did well in the last German elections, but they were still second, and the French have just about held off. And I think the British, I am not one of those people who exaggerates the Nigel Farage threat. I don't think the Nigel Farage threat is as strong as is sometimes portrayed. It feels like the one exception is Trump's victory in America, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, but they do, even those, for one, American elections, even ones that are relative landslides, are decided based on relatively few votes and districts, right? So it's like there's quite a thin sort of wedge, I think, between a Democrat and a Republican government, and Biden was obviously elected in 2020. I think second, and this relates to your Farage point, the problem with these people, populists, let's call them, maybe there's another word for Trump and Musk at this stage, but the problem with them is that they do fight amongst themselves a lot, right? And they tend to implode a bit, and they do one thing or another, and they clash and they fall out, and then one of them gets involved in something that they can't recover from. They just arrested Marine Le Pen, actually, didn't they?
I saw that bit of good news earlier.
Yes, yeah. So I agree. Like I do have hope in that sense, even though the situation in the USA seems very extreme at the moment and quite dire. I don't think we should sort of give in to them and assume that like they've won once, therefore they've won for all and they can do anything that they want. That's what they'd like us to believe. That's clearly what they'd like us to believe, but I don't think it's true at all.
Yeah. But I think it does have to be an education on economic issues. I think, so it's the two things. It's being more mainstream politicians needing to be more educative and to focus on the economic issues and don't get sidetracked on the more social and cultural side.
I mean, there is a lot of evidence from political science that the economy is one of the things that matters to people the most, right? Like it really is. How the economy is doing, how people are being impacted. That is what matters to people. And I don't think that people are sort of really narrowly selfish about it. I think they probably think about their own pockets, but they're probably also thinking about their neighbors and their family and probably the country as a whole to some degree. And that relates to some other evidence from political science, like Leif Lewin. Do you know his work on... Yeah. It's kind of interesting. I don't know how that coheres with what your politicians are saying, but I think it's a kind of enlightened self-interest, perhaps, we can believe, or maybe I'd just like to believe that. But like people, you need to appeal to that. And I think narrow self-interest or enlightened self-interest, the main message is probably quite similar. It's probably about how the economy is going to impact the average person, right? And that's what we need to do.
Yeah.
I was wondering how long it would take me to reference my own book here.
Oh, go on.
But no, it's interesting though, right? Because this one, the Econocracy,
which inspired me hugely.
That's nice to hear. Yeah, I think it's interesting because you do. So we argued so this was released in 2016, I think.
Yeah.
So we were writing it before the Brexit vote. Finished it just after the Brexit vote, which was obviously this big populist backlash. Michael Gove saying we've had enough of experts. I think at one point he compared the OECD economists to Nazi scientists or something. Anyway, there was this big populist backlash, right? And the GDP estimates for Brexit were negative. All economists said this is going to be bad. They were right. I think it was bad, but it didn't get through, right? It didn't get through, and you did see this big backlash. And the thing is, it really relates to what you were talking about to technocracy and the kind of, shush, we're calculating type approach. Central banks, the IMF, the World Bank, I think a focus on growth and efficiency as well, which pervades UK institutions, the balanced budget, all these semi-technical arguments, free trade deals, how that's impacted a lot of communities, all of these things, right? They seem to combine, and you ended up with people just really not trusting economists or technocrats, and I think feeling that a lot of it was kind of obfuscated from them, which is exactly what you're talking about, right?
Yeah. And in fact, sort of around the time that you were writing Econocracy, I was doing research with voters. So this wasn't with politicians, but this was knocking on doors and having conversations with people who really I don't think political scientists normally reach, about what they thought about the economy, and over again that it's not my GDP, the classic quote that I think it was Menon or somebody said, it came out of a kind of public meeting, it was so strong. And I think we, to some extent, maybe in the UK, have learned the lesson from the kind of the kind of George Osborne led. Remember, it was George Osborne who started off leading the Remain team for the referendum, and even David Cameron realised that actually was a mistake and cut him out. And all that endless Treasury forecasts versus, I think
he called Brexit voters economically illiterate at one stage. Explicitly, right? Which is a stark contrast to all the Tories, I think, in your sub. I mean, I don't know if he was in it or not, you can't tell me, but a lot of the Tories and US Republicans were much more, let's not say that about voters, let's meet them where they're at, right? So he was unique in that respect.
He was very unusual, like the whole thing I say in the book about how even in confidential hour-long interviews, politicians won't be disrespectful about voters. It's almost as if it's part of a kind of a socialization or a public, but also they internalize it so much they don't even express it in private. But there is also, I mean, quite interesting conservative perspective that a lot of conservative politicians who were Remainers did say that actually they thought there was also a sense in which Leave voters just wanted to leave so much more for non-economic reasons, that this may have been a rare occasion where the non-economic reasons did trump the economic ones. But I think the thing about technocracy is that I was doing the interviews for the Politicians book 2020 to 2022, and I think some people on the left were beginning to drift back in that direction. Were beginning to sort of say, well, maybe we could actually have a more given that economists have now become more proactive about climate change, and actually that stereotype of economists during the neoliberal era as all being supply siders, well, there are now a lot more economists working on things like inequality and the dangers of health inequality. Maybe in order partly to solve the climate crisis, we should have a new technocracy.
Yes.
Unfortunately, any outsourcing of experts, I think that you do because of how it disempowers voters.
Yeah.
Is going to lead to a backlash, and in a way that is, I suppose, quite a positive message, because it is at least saying that that human beings in the UK and other democracies do have got a sense that they want a stake, and that they should be able to have some kind of control.
Absolutely. I think it's kind of what Biden was doing, setting up a new, more progressive administrative industrial policy state, right, including things like antitrust enforcement and also the Green New Deal, or the variant of it that he enacted, which is obviously kind of being swiftly undone now, right? But I mean, maybe, I don't think this was the only reason it's being undone, but maybe it wasn't democratic enough, right? Like, maybe what you're saying is right, and it's any set of sweeping policies like that actually needs to be done with more direct democratic input and accountability, rather than simply just imposed on people and the money spent in a certain way, and they sort of just experience it as a top-down measure.
Yeah. And I think his problem really was that there were too many other Democrats who'd looked as if they'd been hand in glove with the kind of more neoliberal period, and that the whole Hillary Clinton phenomenon, that she really had also seemed completely out of touch, and he couldn't really do enough to reverse that in his 4-year period.
I mean, we've already hinted at this, right? But like, it's pretty clear that the Democrats appear and maybe are more out of touch than the Republicans.
Yeah.
In general.
Yeah.
I mean, look, Trump is a billionaire, right? But that's just one aspect of his characteristic. He just says whatever comes into his head, and regardless of the content, people like that, right? He's not a carefully curated media presence. He just makes stuff up, and he's quite funny, to be honest. He is pretty funny, he sort of gets away with being actually kind of senile and saying the wrong thing because he's sort of always been like that, and I think it adds to his appeal. Whereas with Joe Biden, he'd sort of trail off, and it seemed quite weird. He'd forget his script, right? Whereas with Trump, there was never really a script anyway, and it's just all a bit random. And people like that, right? I mean, I hate the results, but you can't deny that people like that. And I'm not saying that's necessarily the aim of educative policy making to speak like Trump, but certainly he's getting at something, right? He's speaking from the heart.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting as well. You wouldn't say this because your book's very academic and polite, but it's interesting what contradicts what we say in this, sort of on reflection, because I think that a lot of what we've done with my book and at Rethinking Economics, the student organization, has been quite UK centric. I think not even Eurocentric, UK centric, and I think we almost single out the Anglosphere as being more influenced by economics, right? It does. I think you could draw that theme out. I don't know if we say it explicitly. We probably don't say it explicitly, and we're not like this is only in the UK or whatever. But we do. I do think you could draw that theme out, maybe just from focus. And it's actually not really the case in your data. I think where would you say economists have the most influence? Is it France? And also in a completely different way to the way that we paint it as a kind of, we talk about kind of the influence of mainstream economics and growth and supply and demand and cost benefit analysis, right? But you're talking about a different type of economics, a more plural type of economics, a more interdisciplinary type of economics, which is actually most influential, I think, in France.
Yeah. And I think that's the other thing to bear in mind, that the politicians, and they were only giving their perspective, and you could say that they're always bound to downplay anyone else's influence, to put themselves center stage. But they did generally have what we described as a low level of respect for economists. And, there was almost a league table where you could say that out of France, Germany, Denmark, the UK, and the US, in Germany and Denmark, you were much more likely to get politicians speaking positively about economists. Denmark seemed to have this kind of there's a consensus maybe around Scandinavian welfare economics that politicians seem to follow, spanning from the kind of the left even to some people in the kind of Danish centre right, and they would talk about how economists also believed in the Scandinavian welfare model, and that because it's a small country, they go to the same universities, the politicians and the economists, and then, but that actually the economists who are very much Scandinavian and kind of rooted in that system were to an extent slightly under the thumb of the politicians, but there was still a mutual level of respect there, and people called the wise men, for example, and they did an economic council that they did pay attention to. And the same with a lot of the German politicians. But then in the French case, a more interesting, which is what you alluded to, approach, which I don't think we'd particularly expected, where, some people say that France, economists are quite embedded in French bureaucracy. But when it comes to academic economists and, like the discipline of economics, and the great thinkers, Thomas Piketty or whoever it is, French politicians were reading them more than politicians from any of the 5 countries, so we're intellectually interested in the latest economics writings, but would also see it as a far more a pluralist discipline. So they wouldn't be like the Danish ones who only really talk about their Scandinavian welfare economists, or the German ones who would tend to have a bit more of a neoclassical consensus, or ordo-liberal types if they were on the right. So that was really interesting. But then, counter to what we expected, to what people like Marianne Fourcade, for example, found when she was writing, she was around 2006 or 2009, I think.
Yes.
The American and the British politicians were the least attentive, the least likely to have read somebody you could call an economist in the last 20 years, and also the least respectful. So that's difficult to unpick.
It is. I mean, and I've sort of, it really, I go back and forth on this so much, and I've had a lot of reflection because my channel name is Unlearning Economics. You may or may not know. And I was in the Rethinking Economics movement and the various prefixes attached to economics movements, post-crash economics, whatever, right? All these things. And it was all about post the 2008 financial crisis, which a lot of your politicians cite as discrediting economics in their eyes, right? But there was this big campaign against economics and against technocracy and for pluralism, which is obviously already integrated in France, but maybe not so much in the US and UK. And there was, there was this really, really big push against the superiority of economics, which is what the Fourcade paper is called, I think, and against some of the main ideas that were implicated in the 2008 financial crisis, as well as free trade and the fallout from that and how that relates to Trump and so on. So there was a lot of pushback and against sort of an environmental economics kind of thing. That was a really big factor as well. And I sort of feel like this crystallized for me, along with what's been going on with the election of Trump. But your book crystallized for me. I was like, I feel like that's run its course now, actually. Not that people need to stop criticizing mainstream economics or, rethinking economics need to disband. They're still around and doing a lot of good work with students and stuff. But what I mean is, like, I kind of feel like if US and UK politicians don't respect economists at all, and French politicians who do respect economists have a pluralist and interdisciplinary approach that's very much more integrated with the French state. Meanwhile, the Danish and German economists are more homegrown, you call them, right? They're kind of, they've got this traditional approach. And you actually cite a bunch of economists that I'd never heard of as their influence. So I'm thinking that's a completely different thing. So sort of, for me now, railing against economics, despite my channel name, I'm sort of thinking, I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I don't think this needs to be said anymore in this way. I think we've got a different battle to fight now. And if anything, I think we need more economists on board to fight back against populism and so on.
Economists on board to fight back against populism, and also, the central message to go out, that we all need to focus on economics, whether it's the economics of climate change or, economic policy in other areas. And so I think you're still in the right area, but I would agree. I think there's some kind of a way in which that's yesterday's perspective.
I mean, it was, this makes me feel old. It was, what was it? It was 17 years ago that the 2008 financial crisis hit, right? And it was 10 years ago that we first started talking about Trump. And also it was 5 years ago that the coronavirus pandemic hit, right? So it is easy to end up talking about yesterday's news. And there's that saying, I can't remember to who it's attributed, where it's like, to understand somebody's view, learn what was happening in the world when they were 20, somebody's politics, right? And that comes out with your politicians too. But I think it's easy to get trapped in that, right? And just to assume that we're always in the fallout of the 2008 financial crisis, because I was around 20. And actually, although we haven't moved on in a lot of ways, I think we didn't fully recover from that, and a whole bunch of other stuff went wrong, and we're living in the fallout. I don't think you can keep saying, economists are the problem. They failed in the financial crisis. Now we need to address that. We need to make economics more pluralist and so on. That's just, like you said, yesterday's news.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit. I'm having a bit of a
So
moment.
yeah. Yeah, and I think it's just about future generations and
Yeah,
like anyone young, and I'm really conscious of this because I'm teaching in a school at the moment. Anyone young, you know, everywhere they look, if they're prepared to look, there are so many problems that it feels unfair to say, actually, you need to focus on this,
yeah,
because they've got to have whatever survival strategies they can develop for navigating what they've been dealt with. But you know, you do feel like saying, please focus on the economics, because however hard it is or dry, you know, it's dry and it's technical. It takes a little bit more mental effort than understanding the cultural stuff. But you know,
yeah.
it is the only way that you will continue to have functioning societies, functioning anything, and also do something on the climate.
I mean, I think there is a thirst for it as well, right?
Yeah,
Having started a YouTube channel and being astonished that people will listen to me talk about labor economics for 3 hours, hundreds of thousands of people or views anyway. It's like I think people are eager to engage with economics at
yeah,
numerous levels, and just to make one final barb at the economics profession for all time, it is they do need to get better at talking about it in a way that the Republican politicians were able to understand, right?
yeah,
They just they can't. It's so bad. They're completely unable to do public reach out academic economists, and that's true of some other academics. And the incentives are all wrong. It doesn't get you anything in terms of funding or career progression or reputation, right? So that's the problem. But there is that. We need to see more of that as well, right? Although actually, having said that out loud, that is kind of contradicted by the politicians. They sort of say, you seem to conclude that the politicians have no hope that economists are able to do that, and it's really on them.
No,
Is that too
yeah, but
clear?
I do think that is a bit of conceit on the part of the politicians, and
Right. Yeah.
I
Okay.
shouldn't take that
Yeah.
particularly. I mean, I think you're right that economists need to talk as well, and to be better at communicating as well. And to be honest, it does look as if some of them are trying to make efforts, and there's all the work at people like the Office of National Statistics to
Yeah.
try and present statistics in a more accessible way.
I mean, I remember,
Um,
just to butt in on the ONS. I remember back like 10 years, even 10 years ago, their website was completely unnavigable. It was
yeah,
awful. It's astonishing how bad it was. And now it's like fine. It could still use improvement, but it's like okay. But it was like I can't believe you. We researchers couldn't navigate it. Like you expect the public to do that. But sorry, that's just my little rant.
yeah. But because politicians are supreme communicators,
Yeah.
that's why whatever the economists can do and contribute, it's not going to be as impressive as the politicians. And okay, there's a high level of public distrust of politicians, but I just think they've got to keep trying and keep trying on the communicating and the educating.
Educative, yeah. And I think, I mean, the economists can communicate to politicians as well, right? So there might
Yeah,
be a sort
yeah,
of, I was going to say human centipede, but that's not very nice. So, some kind of passing down of knowledge, right? So it's like, the politicians can probably understand more complex and topics, and maybe they've had an economics class or two, and then they can sort of digest that and pass it on, right? And it's like, so maybe the economist's role is more, not just, but more talking to the politicians because they're not even that good at that. I think there's lots of
yeah,
complaints,
they
weren't
are.
there, from the
Yeah.
politicians?
Yeah, yeah, and there were lots of comments in the book, including of politicians who had themselves been trained as economists about, how poor they still were sometimes when they came and gave advice.
Mm, mm. Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, I mean, I feel like this was a really good chat, and we kind of touched on all of my notes, and we've solved all the problems of the world. So that's I don't know.
I've really enjoyed it. And Yeah, yeah,
No,
yeah.
thanks so much for agreeing to talk to me and doing this research. I mean, one final thing I wanted to ask you, if I may, you told me you moved away from academia after producing this extremely valuable work. I mean, what were the reasons for that? Were there...
Um, it was mainly, it's mainly partly that I didn't want to carry on living in London, so it's kind of mainly a practical / personal thing.
I get that.
But also the chance to interview politicians in this way, this was very kind of qualitative stuff. I was working with Lucy Barnes, who's absolutely
Yes,
fantastic. She's now
she's great. Yeah,
professor at UCL, and she really gave a lot of freedom. And this kind of qualitative research is still too rare. It's still too rare in political science. It's still too rare, definitely in economics. And it's empirical. And that's what I liked about it, because for me, it's all got to be about the quality of the research, in the sense of trying to get as close as possible to what is really happening on the ground, and hearing the views of, in this case, politicians in depth and without preconception, and not being so blinded by the theory. And I suppose if I did have a criticism of social sciences and academic social sciences, it's that people aren't out there enough. You are, but huge numbers of academics are still kind of too blocked from really understanding what's motivating voters or other
I
economic and
mean, you
political
mentioned
actors.
going door to door with voters, right? And that is a very eye-opening experience, right? Like,
Yeah,
I've
yeah,
only done it once and very briefly. I could do it. I should do it more. But I just like it is just to hear what people are thinking about, how they perceive politics, which is often as an afterthought, to be honest. Anyway, it's not even
yeah,
that they're not in the space of political theory and stuff like you are, thinking about whether they're a consequentialist or a deontologist or whatever, right? But like also just how they perceive issues and stuff. It's so eye-opening that like
yeah.
everybody with any type of political aspiration or inclination or academic aspiration, or who's in journalism or whatever, all of those industries, right, the sort of intellectual industries, that's definitely something that you need to do at the very minimum.
But it's also something that it keeps you with a sense of purpose and is energizing
Sure.
and fulfilling. And
Yeah.
so, say in your case, yeah, and I mean, it would seem to be something that you would get a huge amount out of,
Yeah.
and that would improve the quality of the work that people were doing.
Yeah. Absolutely, 100%. And I think one other thing I wanted to say about the book is that I learned a lot about politicians and economic experts, but I think one of the really illuminating things for me about what you did, which was just go out and talk to people about their countries, is that I just learned a lot about the countries as well. I was just just seeing Danes and Germans and French people talk about their countries, which are countries that, I mean, they're not they're not like global south countries. They're just countries you don't hear about as much in the news, right? And like all of their intellectual traditions, their legal traditions, their political traditions, how that works, right? And just understanding a little bit more about the world. And you just, if you're stuck in these theoretical problems or even statistical empirical research, you're just not going to get any of this. You're not going to understand the world as well. And all it takes, I mean, not to minimize the research, but I'm just saying this is like one piece of research on the topic, right? Like if there were more people doing this, I just think we'd have such a deeper understanding of like what is going on across the world politically, what's going on in people's heads, what's going on in the government, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
No, that sounds good.
Yeah.
I think we've talked ourselves up. We've talked ourselves back up.
I encourage anyone who is an aspiring researcher or an active researcher or just anyone really to take this on board and think about like what you want to do, because another regression, another theoretical model is not gonna be as mind altering, I think, as research like this. Okay, well, Anna, I'll let you go. But again, this has been really, really, really great. It's good to finally speak to you. I tracked you down after making
I'm
some
so glad
efforts.
you did. Yeah, thank you.
I managed to track you down after a couple of email addresses didn't work. But yeah, it's been so good. So thanks for speaking to me.
Thank you. Thanks, Carl.
See
Thanks.
you.